So today we're doing 5.1 in congruence and triangles. So here, how do you identify, or what do you use to show that two line segments are congruent? Tick marks. So that is shown right here. But what do we do if there are multiple congruent segments?
You put more tick marks.
You add more. And then what do we use to show that two angles are congruent?
You use a half circle.
We use these right here, right? Those little kind of half circles, those little arcs. And then how do we show if there are more?
You make it bigger.
So instead of making bigger, we actually just double them up. So we could have that, or we could have 3. Up here we could have had 1 tick mark, or we could have had 2 tick marks, 3 tick marks. Are we ever going to have more than 3 tick marks if we're dealing with triangles? No. Nope, because there's only 3 sides. Okay, so here we are going to draw on these triangles. So our first one is we want to see that the sides that are congruent. So the sides that are congruent are we have 1 congruent side here, we have 1 congruent side here, and we have 1 congruent side here. We have a second side that's congruent between the triangles. So this one is congruent to this triangle side here and this triangle side here. And then we have this third side, which would be congruent to this side here and this side here. Notice that we are going up in tick marks. So we see that the ones with the 3 tick marks are congruent to the ones with 3 tick marks. The one with the 2 tick marks is congruent to the one with the 2 tick marks. The one with the 1 tick mark is congruent to the one with the 1 tick marks. And we do the same thing with angles. So when we look at angles, we see this angle here is congruent to this angle here and this angle here. We see that, yes ma'am? We see that this angle here is congruent to this angle here, which is congruent to this angle here. Okay, sorry about that. And then our last one, which is over here, 1, 2, 3. We have 1, 2, 3, and we have 1, 2, 3. So we see the ones with the same number of arcs are congruent to the ones with the same number of arcs, and that's happening in all 3. Over here, we have no symbols, so we know that none of those are going to be congruent. Are you guys okay with this portion? Can I switch the slide? Okay. So we have 3 definitions today. I'm going to give you a second to write them down, then we'll talk about them. So our first one was corresponding angles. Angles in separate triangles that match or are congruent to each other. We have corresponding sides. Sides in separate triangles that match or are congruent to each other. And then we have 2 triangles are congruent if all corresponding parts are congruent. So those are the 3 definitions for this section. I'm going to switch the slide. Our next one is our first group of examples. So we're going to determine whether the angles or the sides are corresponding angles, corresponding sides, or neither. So we're looking at angle A and angle M. So we go to angle A. We see we have 2 arcs. And angle M has how many? 2 arcs. So we say that those are corresponding. Are those angles or sides? So they're going to be corresponding angles. So I'm just going to write CORR, angles. Our next one, we are looking at AC, which has how many tick marks? This is the side, so we're looking at the tick marks.
2.
That's 2. And then we are looking at ML, and it has 1. Are those matching?
No.
No, so we say that they're neither. They don't have the same amount of tick marks, so it's neither. Next, we're looking at B, angle B, and angle N. So how many arcs does angle B have? 1. And how many does angle N have?
2. 3.
It has 3. Do those match?
No.
So it's neither. And last but not least, we're looking at BC. So BC is here. How many tick marks does it have?
3.
And then we have LN. LN has how many? 3. So these are corresponding what? Corresponding sides. Okay, so I put these steps on your sheet. So our first one is we're going to start with the angles of the triangle, and then we're going to list 3 pairs of corresponding angles. Our next one is we're going to look at the sides, and we're going to list 3 pairs of corresponding sides. and then we are going to do our congruence statement. I say order matters, and you're going to see why on our next slide. Okay, so list all corresponding parts, and then write a congruence statement. So we're going to start with angles, because that's what it said. Number one, we're going to list corresponding angles. So we're going to go with the one that has one arc. So angle D is congruent to which angle?
K.
Angle K. And we have one that has two arcs, which is angle E is congruent to which angle?
J.
And then we have angle F, which is congruent to
O.
angle I, because they each have three arcs.
Does this stand for corresponding angles?
Yep. And then we have corresponding sides. Okay, I'll give you 1 second. Okay, so now we're going to list corresponding sides. So I have side DE is congruent to angle
KJ.
KJ. So remember, these are sides, so you can label them the other direction. So you could have had ED or DE, and you could have had KJ or JK. So each of these had one tick mark. Our next group that has two tick marks is going to be EF and JI. And our last one is DF and DF and KI. Okay, so we see that we have corresponding angles. So D corresponds to K, angle E corresponds to angle J, angle F corresponds to angle I, and then we have corresponding sides. Side DE corresponds with side KJ, and so on. And this is where order matters. So we're going to write out our congruent statement of our triangles. So we're going to say triangle, and I'm going to say DEF. So what I did is I went directly down this column here. Triangle DEF is congruent to triangle KJI. And this is where we see that coming into play. So if you look at this written out, we see that when we have it written like this, that angle D in the first position is congruent with angle K. They correspond together. We see the second position, angle E, is congruent and it corresponds to angle J, also in the second position. And angle F is congruent to angle I. So we wrote them out, and exactly the position of the letters tells you which one is congruent to the one in the other triangle. But the same thing happens with sides. We see that DE is congruent to KJ. And we see that EF is congruent to JI. And then for the third one, we take the first letter and the last letter, and then the first letter and the last letter. So we see that DF is congruent to KI. I left the line above it. So that's why order matters, so that we can tell all of that just by this one symbol. Can I switch the slide?
No.
Okay. So example 3, we want to list all corresponding parts, corresponding congruent parts, and then write a congruent statement. So let's start with congruent angles. I changed the page, so give me 1 second to go back. So that's number 3 we're on, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with angle B. So corresponding angles. I'm going to switch my color because I've been using that lilac looking color for a while. So we have angle B, which is congruent to angle G. And then we have angle C, which is congruent to angle
H.
And then we have angle, which is congruent to angle. So here we're just matching the arcs on one triangle with the arch on the other. That tells us that they are congruent and corresponding. Now we're going to do corresponding sides. So corresponding sides. So the one with the 1 tick mark.
CB.
So we have CB is congruent to HG. And then we have CD, which is congruent to HI. And then we have,
DB,
which is congruent to
IG.
IG. And again, make sure you have that. These are segments, so the segment line has to be on top. I went back and added a couple. So then we have to write the congruent statement. And so again, we're going to do that triangle. I'm going to use another color so you can see this. We're going to write these for our first triangle and these for our second. So we have triangle BCD is congruent to triangle GHI. Yep. So this is one way to write it. This is a very consistent way. And we see again that we had to write it where the corresponding angles are in the same spots. And then we can still make that same statement about BC is congruent to GH, CD is congruent to HI, BD is congruent to GI. Are you guys okay? And you can see everything that we're going through. Any questions so far? Okay, so now we have triangle BDC and triangle MLK. We want to list all corresponding congruent parts. So we're going to draw those onto our triangle. So our first spot here is I'm going to start using this color. We're going to see that we have angle B is congruent to angle M. They're both in the first position. So I'm going to draw my arc in, angle B and angle M. And I'm going to write them down here. So corresponding angles. So we see that angle B is congruent with angle M. We're going to go on to our middle, which is D and L. So we see that D is congruent to angle L. And we see that the angle D congruent with angle L and our corresponding. And our last one is our last one in the position. And that is C and K. And we see that C is congruent with angle K. Does anybody have any questions on how we got these angles? Okay, so now we're going to do corresponding sides. Okay. So over here, I'm going to do this above so you can see which ones I'm talking about. So our first two are BD, and they correspond with ML. So BD corresponds with ML. Is congruent with ML. Our next one goes to the last two. So we have DC and LK. So DC, LK. And then finally, we have, it's our first letter and our last letter. First letter and last letter. So that's BC and MK. So BC is congruent to angle MK. Okay, so our next spot is given the fact that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, we want to find the length of segment DF and measure of angle B. So we need to go through our triangle just like we did and decide which sides and which angles are congruent. So we see that based on the position that we have angle A is congruent to which one?
D.
Angle D. We have angle B, which is congruent to E, and then we have angle C, which is congruent to angle F. So we see here that we're interested in the measure of angle B. So the measure of angle B, so angle B is congruent to which angle? Angle E, yep. And we know that the measure of angle B equals the measure of angle E. What is the measure of angle E?
40.
So it's going to be 40 degrees. So we see that those correspond and are congruent, and therefore we have the measure of angle B being 40 degrees. Now we're going to do the same thing with the sides. So our first side, AB, is congruent to which side? So AB, yep, ED or DE, because they're the first part here. Then we have our second side, which is BC, which is congruent to EF. BC, which is EF. And then our last one, which is the first letter A and the last letter C. So AC, which goes with DF. So here we're looking for the measure of DF. Well, we see DF is congruent to which side? AC. So therefore, DF and AC have the same measurement. Remember, when we're talking about distance, we no longer need that segment line on top because it's a distance. And we see that we have a distance of what for AC? It's 4. So DF also has to be 4. So we have our two solutions right here. There's one more step with the question B. We have to find the missing angle. So how do I find the measure of angle A? So we aren't going to need a square root because if it's a right triangle, we could do the Pythagorean theorem. But we are missing an angle measure. What's the sum of the interior angles of a triangle? It's 180, and we have 2. So we're going to take 180, and we're going to subtract the 2 angles that we have. So for angle A, it's 180 minus 85 plus 52 degrees. Can somebody perform that operation? It's going to be a little bigger than 137 because 85 plus 50 is going to be in the...
Oh, yeah.
But thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, wait. 43?
It's going to be 43 degrees.
I was going to added together.
Oh. Yeah, okay. Fair enough. Yes, it would be, and then you were going to subtract them. So you just did one more. Yep. Okay, and then we want to now see what the length of BC and the measure of angle DR. So again, we have to then see the correspondence that is happening. We are using the exact same one from the first part of this problem. It applies to both. So we've already done it. So we see that A corresponds to D. We see that B corresponds to, I think I hear, E. So B corresponds to E. And then we have C, which corresponds to, so remember that has 3 tick marks or arcs. Okay, so now we want to find the measure of angle D. So angle D is congruent to which angle? A. So angle D is congruent to angle A. And we know that the measure of angle D equals the measure of angle A, which is what value? 43 degrees. Nice job. And then we have to do the same thing with the sides. So once again, we see that AB gets 1 tick mark, and it's congruent to side DE. We have BC, which is congruent to which one? Which is congruent to EF. And last but not least, AC, and which one did you say? Okay, so we are looking for the length of BC. So BC is congruent to which side?
D.
So we have BC. It has how many tick marks?
EF.
2, and so it's going to be that EF, yes. And so we see the distance of BC equals the distance of EF, and we know the distance of EF is what? 10. So we have our 2 answers right there. So we have 2 more examples to go. So our last one, given the fact that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, this is the one we just did. Let's try this one now. So determine whether the triangles are congruent. If so, write a congruent statement. So we're going to go through and we're going to list all the corresponding angles and all the corresponding sides. And let's see. So first one, we have corresponding angles, CORR angles. So angle B corresponds to which angle? Angle G. And angle C corresponds to which angle? It's congruent to? Angle H. And angle D is congruent to? Angle I. And now we're going to do corresponding sides. I'm going to give you a second to finish writing those. So when we look at our corresponding sides, I have side CB, which is congruent to which one? HG or GH, either direction. And then we have CD, which is congruent to HI. And last but not least, we have DB, which is congruent to GI. So each angle is congruent to an angle on the other triangle, and each side is congruent to an angle on the other triangle. So there's corresponding sides and corresponding angles. So we can say that triangle, once again, I am using these letters here, going straight down. BCD is congruent to triangle, GHI. So our next one, we notice that it does not give us what? It doesn't give us angles. So let's begin by doing the sides. So we have side RS is congruent to side EF. So that's corresponding sides. I'm going to switch my color again just because I don't like it. It's just pretty light. So then we have side. I started with the bottom ones. I'm going to label them real quick so we don't flip them. I have one here and two here. So I did RS, and now I'm going to do SD, which is congruent to. And then we have our next one, which is congruent to. FD or DF. Okay, now we have to figure out the angles. So we see that there's corresponding congruent sides for both triangles, but now we have to see the angles. There is one relationship that we see. Are you raising your hand? So what relationship is here? What type of angles are these?
Vertical.
They're vertical. What do we know about vertical angles?
They're congruent.
They're congruent. Because these are two angles that have the same vertice here, I'm going to label these with the three letters. It's the only one I'm going to do that way, but that's the only reason is because there's two that have that middle point of D. So corresponding angles. So I see that I have angle RDS, which is congruent to angle EDF. So D's in the middle because that's the angle I'm interested in. Like that. Now I have to see the relationship between these angles. Do you guys see a pair of triangles in the triangles that R and F? How do you know that? I. So you said R and F. I agree, but I need to know a reasoning. Can anybody see? They're across from each other. What does this tell us? You guys remember what these signs here, these little arrows on these lines tell us? Anybody?
That they are the best.
Tells us that they're parallel, right?
Yeah.
So we have two parallel lines that are cut by a transversal. So over here on this green poster, if you need a picture to catch up from that section, I'm going to draw this off to the side. I have two lines, two parallel lines that are cut by a transversal. And I'm interested in the angles that are F, so that would be this angle here, and this angle here, which is R. So the relationship between those angles, what are they? So what relationship do we have? They're going to be alternate interior angles, and we know alternate interior angles are congruent. So we have angle R is congruent to angle F. We have another picture that we're going to draw, very similar, but on the other side, we have two parallel lines being cut by a transversal. The transversal is a little wonky, so let's try that again. And now we are interested in this angle here and this angle here. What's the relationship between those two? So we have this angle here and this angle here. They're alternate interior angles. We know alternate interior angles are congruent. So we know that angle S is congruent to angle E. So 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now we see that every angle and every side is congruent to and corresponds to a side in the other triangle. So we can now write that congruent statement. So we have triangle D, and I'm just going to go straight down the middle here. RS is congruent to triangle, and then I have D. Which one of those is supposed to be E? The second one. Thank you. So then that's supposed to be D, F, E. So let's do a fist of 5 rating.